Welcome to Professor O'Donnell TV. In this episode, we present to you the transatlantic slave trade, how the British and American empires built their wealth on African backs. 1. Sold and shackled, how the British and American empires built their wealth on African backs. The transatlantic slave trade remains one of history's darkest chapters, a tale of greed, suffering, and dehumanization that shaped the modern world. From the 16th to the 19th centuries, the British and American empires enslaved millions of Africans, turning them into commodities to fuel their growing economies. This story examines how these empires systematically exploited African lives to build their wealth and power. 1. The origins of the trade. The transatlantic slave trade began with European exploration of the African coast in the 15th century. Initially, interactions were centered on trade in gold, ivory, and other goods. However, as European colonies in the Americas grew, so did the demand for labor. Indigenous populations, decimated by disease and violence, could not meet the needs of plantations. African slaves became the solution. The British became key players in the trade during the 17th century, dominating the triangular trade system. Ships departed Britain laden with manufactured goods like textiles, guns, and alcohol, which were exchanged for slaves in West African ports. These human beings were forcibly taken from their villages, often through violent raids or by being sold by local leaders desperate for European goods. 2. The Middle Passage. The journey across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage, was a horrifying ordeal. Africans were shackled, crammed into the holds of ships with barely any space to move, and subjected to unspeakable conditions. Disease, malnutrition, and abuse were rampant. Historians estimate that 12 to 15 million Africans were transported, with as many as 2 million dying before reaching their destinations. Survivors of the Middle Passage were sold at auctions like livestock upon arrival in the Americas. Families were torn apart, and individuals were stripped of their identities, renamed, and branded like property. 3. Laboring for empires. Once sold, African slaves became the backbone of colonial economies on sugar plantations in the Caribbean, cotton fields in the American South, and tobacco farms in Virginia. Enslaved people toiled under brutal conditions. Their labor generated immense profits for British and American landowners. In Britain, the wealth generated from plantations funded industrialization. Ports like Liverpool and Bristol thrived on the slave trade, becoming hubs of commerce. Wealthy merchants built mansions, and banks that financed slavery became pillars of the economy. In America, slavery fueled the agricultural economy of the South, producing cotton that powered northern textile mills and global markets. This dependency on enslaved labor laid the foundation for the economic divide that would later lead to the American Civil War. For justifications and resistance, the British and American elites justified slavery through racist ideologies, claiming Africans were inferior and destined to serve. Religion was also manipulated to endorse slavery, with biblical passages cited to validate the practice. Despite this, enslaved Africans resisted at every turn. Revolts, sabotage, and the preservation of African culture and traditions were acts of defiance. Figures like Olaudah Equiano, a freed slave who became a prominent abolitionist, exposed the horrors of slavery to the world. 5. Abolition and legacy. The abolition of slavery was a slow and arduous process. In Britain, the 1807 abolition of the Slave Trade Act ended the trade, though slavery itself persisted in colonies until 1833. In America, the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 and the 13th Amendment of 1865 marked the end of slavery, but only after a bloody civil war. However, the legacy of slavery continues to affect societies. The wealth accumulated by British and American elites from African enslavement left a lasting economic disparity. The social and racial hierarchies established during slavery remain entrenched, fueling systemic racism and inequality today. 6. Conclusion. A reckoning with history. Sold and shackled is more than a historical account. It's a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable suffering. The wealth of the British and American empires was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, a truth that demands acknowledgement, education, and redress. Recognizing this history is the first step toward dismantling the lingering shadows of slavery and ensuring a more equitable future. Subscribe to this channel to get the part 2 of this episode and more interesting